I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Come on in. It's fine. Welcome to our panel on the case for open immigration. It's nice to be here with you. As some of you know in the room, our mission at FFF is to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. We are libertarians. In fact, the three of us on this panel are libertarians. I'm joined by Richard Ebeling, who is the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Enterprise at the Citadel, and Jeff Tucker, who is the founder of Liberty.me and the digital director at the Foundation for Economic Education. I grew up on the Texas-Mexican border on a farm. We hired illegal aliens. And so I was exposed to the immigration morass in which we find ourselves from the time I was just a child. We had Border Patrol agents as part of what was really a police state in the American Southwest, coming onto our farm whenever they wanted without warrants, busting our workers. And it always befuddled me as to why it was that government could have the power to interfere with peaceful, mutual, consensual, beneficial transactions. For my entire life, there's been an ongoing immigration crisis. You know, there's these paroxysms periodically where the public gets really anxious about it and upset about it, and they're screaming, and then it subsides, and then all of a sudden a few years later it bursts back up. But there's always a crisis. There always has been a crisis for my entire lifetime, and the lifetime of everybody in this room. And that's not surprising, because you see, that's what socialism does. Socialism produces crises. Or as Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, put it, socialism produces planned chaos. You have in the immigration area a government board that is determining planning in a central fashion, central planning. The movements of millions of people all over the world into the United States. They sit there and determine which countries are going to be allocated which immigrants, what the numbers will be, what their qualifications will be, what the quotas for each area are going to be. This is central planning in its purest form. And so, not surprisingly, as we learned in the 20th century and as we continue to learn, central planning produces chaos and crises. And there's really only one solution to this morass, and that's freedom and free markets. Now, we often get accused as libertarians of saying, you know, you libertarians are just not practical. It's not practical. Open borders, are you crazy? That's just not practical. That's pie in the sky stuff. But actually, we are the only practical ones, because we're the only ones advocating something that works. Because free markets are the only thing that works. We see that domestically, where people are crossing borders between the respective states freely. It didn't have to be that way. The framers could have put in the Constitution that every state would have the power to control the borders, so that people from one state could not just freely cross into another state where they could steal people's jobs or go on welfare because some states have more welfare than other states, or terrorists, domestic terrorists could cross state lines. They could have done everything to keep us safe and secure by putting immigration controls between the states. They didn't do that. We have the greatest free movements of people zone in history. And it's a major cause of the economic prosperity of the American people. Nobody worries about a trade deficit between, Florida and Virginia. Nobody even knows what the deficit is. It's irrelevant. That's because free markets work. They coordinate people's activities. And so it's no different in the area of immigration, of international movements of people. People flying into the United States from different countries to tour, to visit. No questions asked. You just pick up your luggage, you go to your hotel, you invest, you spend, you work, and no one would care. In fact, no one would even notice. How many times do Americans go and ask somebody for their citizenship? Nobody does, except the Immigration Service. But when we encounter people in casual conversation, we very rarely say, "May I see your papers," to make sure you're an American. And that's the way it would be under a regime of open borders, is that there'd be people interacting with each other and not really caring what their citizenship was. Now, two of the major objections, well, that back when I was a kid and up through the 70s, I guess, the 80s, the major objection was, and this is the one Milton Friedman raises, that as long as you have a welfare state, you can't have open immigration. Friedman was wrong. It's nonsense. Of course you can have open immigration with a welfare state. For one thing, most immigrants are not coming to get on welfare. They're coming to work. They want to get rich. And one thing's for certain, you're not going to get rich on welfare. And so that produces an economic vitality in a society that far outweighs the small number of people that are going on food stamps. But there's absolutely no reason why the law has to provide for welfare for foreigners. So what we libertarians say is concentrate on the wrongdoing. Don't punish the innocent people. Don't violate their rights. Their rights of freedom of movement, economic liberty, freedom of contract, freedom to pursue happiness. You know, that fundamental unalienable right that adheres to all men that we just celebrated on the 4th of July. Don't violate those rights for the sake of a small minority that might go on welfare. My position is, in response to Friedman, if it results in higher taxes, so be it. I will bear the cost of higher taxes. Just don't take away my freedom. And it's my freedom that immigration controls interfere with too. My freedom to hire who I want, to do what I want with my money, to associate with whom I want to associate with. But the other objection that we hear nowadays, ever since the U.S. military and the national security state started intervening in the Middle East, is the big Muslim threat. I mean, that's the one we often hear now. Jacob, at our booth here, we've already heard it. Jacob, do you know anything about Muslims? How much do you know about Islam? How much have you read the Quran? And you know, all these aggressive types things. And of course, you never heard any of these objections during the Cold War. That's when the official fear was communists. I mean, if you understand the language of the communist threat during the entire Cold War, just put Muslims in there, and it's an adequate substitute. I don't live my life in fear of Muslims. I don't live my life in fear of terrorists. I don't pace the floors in my house every night, lock my door thinking the terrorists and the Muslims are coming. I don't. And I really didn't do it during the Cold War either. You know, they were exhorting us to look for communists under our beds and stuff. But my position is, look, don't take away my freedom. But Jacob, we have to keep you safe. No, I don't want to be kept safe. Don't keep me safe. I will take my chances with the terrorists. I will take my chances with the Muslims. Don't take away my freedom. I don't want your surveillance schemes. I don't want your Patriot Act. I don't want your assassination program. Don't keep me safe. I will take my chances. Because if I'm going to die at the hands of anybody, I want to die a free man. And so that's where we libertarians stand. Now, of course, there's a solution to this terrorist problem. It's just bring the troops home. I mean, here you have this fascinating confluence of two government programs, foreign interventionism and immigration controls, where they reinforce each other. But if you want to stop the terrorist threat, just bring the troops home. Finally. They've been killing Muslims for 25 years, and they started the killing. The retaliation came second. For 25 years, they've been killing people in the Middle East and Afghanistan. It's time to stop it. They've killed enough people. Bring them home. The terrorist, anti-American terrorism will disappear. And they said, oh, they tell us, oh no, they're coming to get us. They said the same thing about the Vietnamese. They killed umpteen numbers of Vietnamese people in the Vietnam War. They sacrificed 58,000 of my generation, saying, oh, well, now that we've killed so many, we have to keep killing them because they're going to come and get us. Well, not one Vietnamese, once the troops were out of Vietnam, ever came to get us. And the same thing will happen with Muslims and people in the Middle East. They may continue fighting over there, and undoubtedly will. They will leave Americans alone once the U.S. national security stays out there. But whatever, even if they don't bring the troops home, don't keep me safe by taking away my freedom with immigration controls, surveillance schemes, and the like. In sum, we have a heritage in this country of economic liberty. We have a heritage of open immigration. We have a heritage of free markets. We have abandoned that heritage in favor of socialism, interventionism, central planning, and we're reaping the whirlwind. The way to get back to founding principles in this country is to move back toward the libertarian concepts of freedom and free markets. Richard Ebeling.
morning. The issue of freedom of movement of people has been part of the history of America from the beginning. We were a new continent. People came from Europe. They came as free men, as indentured servants, to win their freedom by serving for a period of time, to pay off a debt often. And if one reads the Declaration of Independence, and not just the famous phrases that we all learned in school about our inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the list of enumerated grievances against the British Crown that led the Founding Fathers to revolt and declare their independence, one of them is that the British Crown was limiting the free movement of people, the migration of people. And what were they complaining about? That the British Crown was preventing people from moving to and settling in the 13 colonies. One of the basic premises of wanting freedom from Great Britain was the freedom of people to move to the New World. That was the practice and the premise and the policy of the United States government for virtually all of the 19th century. You could come to America without passport, without visa. And it is estimated that between 1840 and 1914, the beginning of the First World War, 60 million people, that's 60 million people left Europe to make new homes in other parts of the globe. And of the 60 million who chose to leave Europe to escape religious persecution, political oppression, lack of economic opportunity because of the regulations and controls of the governments in the old world, approximately 35 million of them came to the United States. They landed at Ellis Island when Ellis Island became established as an entree point in New York Harbor. Were there customs agents and migration agents, immigration agents? Yeah. But they asked basically two questions. Did you have a communicable disease? If you did, and there was an incubation period, they'd hold you on Ellis Island until your ability to spread it to others had passed. And they asked another question, and to use what is now the politically incorrect phrase, are you an imbecile? Do you have a mental defect that might make you dependent upon the charity of others? And that was at a time, they weren't talking about the welfare state, they were concerned about private charity. But the fact is that if you did not have a communicable disease, and you were not defined, however they defined it at that time, of a mental defect, you got on a ferry at Ellis Island to the southern tip of Manhattan, you disembarked, and welcome to America. That's how my grandparents came here, on both sides of my family. On my father's side, they were German, my father's father, and in the case of his mother, my grandmother on my father's side, English-Irish. On my mother's side, they were Russian and Lithuanian Jews. My grandmother would tell me stories that as a very little girl, before the First World War, Imperial Russia, the Cossacks would come into the village where she lived with state-sponsored approval and proceed to kill people, destroy property, burn down homes, merely because of a religious persecution. They all came here for the chance for a new hope in America, where it didn't matter what your national origin was, it didn't matter what your religion was. You were expected to just make your own way, and in principle to be judged both in the eyes of the law and in the philosophy of the country as an individual. Now, the law tended not to discriminate in those days. Was there private discrimination? Of course. People hold strange and bizarre views that are often biased and irrational, but the state did not, in general, get in the way of the individual who had come to America for a second chance. And which one of us, at some point in our lives, have not hoped or wished for a second chance? They are the basis of our country. The immigration barriers came into effect on racial lines in the 1880s and 1890s, first against the Chinese and the Japanese. Oh, they're different, they look different than us. Oh, you know, they're going to be a bad influence on the little kids. They're going to draw them into the opium dens. but it was all the rhetoric of people like Samuel Gompers, the head of the AFL, whose members were afraid of the competition of new entrants into the American labor market. And of course, it wasn't just that basis. Oh, the Irish came in the 1840s because of the potato famine. And then the Germans came in the 1860s and 70s to escape the conscription into Bismarck's wars to unify Germany. And then the Jews came in the 1890s in the first decade of the 20th century. And the same fears were expressed. Those Irish, well, they're all drunks, aren't they? And how can they be true Americans? They worship the Pope. And those Germans showed up. How could they ever be real Americans? What? They just sit around in these areas of cities, refusing to learn the language. They keep speaking German. And they would just want to drink out of these huge beer steins, and on Sunday go to the park and listen to that stupid military papa music. And the Jews, oh, those Jews, not only are they not Christians, they killed Jesus. Oh no, that's the end of America. Now we laugh at that today, okay? We consider this absurd. But the waves of immigrants that have continued to come into the United States are no different than those who, in terms of the people in this room, were our ancestors. Is their skin pigmentation a little different? Is their original language different than some of the European languages? But they come here for the same reason, as Jacob was saying. Escaping religious persecution, desiring to make a better economic life for themselves and their families, hoping to have an environment of peace and security. And they add to the wealth and the prosperity of the country. They do not detract from it. With every additional mouth that comes to America comes two hands to work. And you know what? The new waves of immigrants, no matter where they're from today, were just like the waves before. They fill the jobs and the occupations that many of we, the native-born or economically better off Americans, don't want to undertake. There are home cleaners, there are gardeners, they're the people who run the little shops and stores along our streets. But you know what? The previous generations were the same. When the Irish came in the 1840s and 1850s, they started as inexpensive and domestic servants who were considered so worthless that in the Old South before the Civil War, when you needed to send workers out into the swamps like in Louisiana, you wouldn't send a slave to do the work. But the gator might eat the slave. You paid good money for the slave. But an Irish worker, he's so cheap, let him be eaten by the gator. There's plenty more of them to hire. But they worked hard, and they hoped that their children would get a better education than they had. And they saved some money, and they started businesses, and they passed it on to their children as well. And then the next wave of people came, and they filled the jobs at the lower end of the ladder, and they moved up. It is the same in the current environment. They all come for the same hope and dream. A country where they have a chance for themselves and their families as individuals. That is the philosophy of this country. Individualism. Not a collectivism of race, religion, tribe, ethnicity. If one becomes an American citizen, one takes an oath of office. An oath of allegiance. I know this because my wife is Russian, and she did that many years ago. And do you know what you find? Do you know what you find with that oath of allegiance? It's not an oath to a piece of geography. It is not an oath to waving fields of grain. It is not an oath to two shining seas. It's an oath that you turn your back on allegiances to kings and princes and potentates of other nations, and you declare an allegiance to abide by and defend the Constitution of the United States. And what is the Constitution? It's basically an organizational chart of enumerated tasks and duties of the three branches of government. Why would you take an oath of allegiance to an organizational chart? Because that Constitution is meant to capture the institutional setting in which a set of principles are to be secured and protected. And those principles are the Declaration of Independence. That all human beings have a right to life, liberty, happiness, and as the Founding Fathers believed as well, honestly acquired private property. That is why, to be true to our fundamental and basic and original principles, we must believe not only in the protection of private property, not only in the protection of free enterprise in commerce and trade, but the freedom of the human being to live and work and reside wherever and for whatever purpose he desires, as long as it is peaceful and respectful for the rights of his neighbors. We cannot be Americans, and what Americanism originally stood for, unless as part of it is the belief in the right of people to move and live. Free immigration is part of the American heritage. Thank you very much.
Those were two amazing statements, and I'm so thrilled to be invited to be here. And let me just also say something on behalf of the Foundation for the Future of Freedom, because this is an organization that has advocated the position of open immigration for many years, right?
From the beginning?
From the beginning.
27 years.
27 years, and probably not a lot of financial benefit has come to you as a result of that position. This is a, you know, and I'm grateful to it because, you know, you never know when these issues are going to become a big deal. 2 years ago, not many people were talking about the subject of immigration. There wasn't a kind of hysteria that I remember. In fact, I looked at the public opinion polls, and most people were very satisfied with U.S. immigration policy. And then at this very event last year, a certain politician by the name of Donald Trump showed up and whipped up a public frenzy, the likes of which I have never seen in my own life, from the podium, and began to talk about the real enemy of Americans, which was not the government, you know, but some strange foreign elements that were invading our borders. And I remember very well a nice young Hispanic man coming to the microphone to ask a very sensible question. He was shouted down by Donald Trump, who demanded to know if he had been sent by the Mexican government. True. If you were here, you'd remember this. And that was an amazing moment for me because I realized, I wondered, how's this crowd going to respond to this frenzy? And my impression was that at the beginning of the speech, very few people had any interest in what this man had to say, and certainly not an elected president. But by the end, I would say, you know, a third, a half, maybe more, had been brought around. There's something about that sort of fear-mongering, that sense that we're being invaded by people who are not like us, that taps into something very deep, something very dangerous, I think, within all of us. And it was an important moment in my life because I finally had to come to terms with something, and it was this. I had not really seriously engaged this topic in a way in which I should have. My own personal history with the immigration issue goes back to when I was first, converted to the cause of human liberty. And I was like, I think a sophomore in college, and part of that conviction that I developed, that the whole basis of civilization, the whole basis of prosperity and the good life was human liberty itself, and free migration was just part of that. It was just, I assumed that open immigration was just part of free markets and part of sound money and individual rights. And I had a very good friend named, that doesn't matter his name, but he was running for this Texas State House at the time. He was my best friend, and we had become sort of libertarians together. And as soon as he began the campaign, he was confronted with the question, what are you going to do about immigration? He said, well, open the borders. And he watched his poll numbers collapse. So he changed his mind. And he saw his poll numbers increase. And that created a certain tension between us as friends. And I said, look at you, you're selling out. You want to use the state to harm rights of people outside of our borders and Americans, importantly. Our rights, as Jacob said, to hire people at our will. And it created tremendous tension in our relationships. I remember that I think at some point I had a principled position, but then in about 1989, an interesting thing happened to me. I was with Murray Rothbard and a few other friends, and we were visiting with a group of paleo-conservatives in Illinois, associated with Chronicles magazine. And they were hardcore anti-immigration people. And we imagined that somehow we would cooperate with them in, I don't actually remember why we thought we would do this, but we did. And so the topic of immigration came up, and he became furious in the way that people become furious over this topic. And because I had said in the meeting that I favored open borders, and he looked at me fiercely and strongly and pointed his finger at me, and he said to me, "You are a fool. Let me ask you a very pointed question. If 1 million, 5 million, 10 million people immigrated across the southern border within the next year, do you think that you would be freer at the end of the year than you are today?"
And richer.
But he asked, will you be freer, right? Because he knew I cared about freedom. And you know, that was an interesting question. Can you imagine the scene, right? Yeah. And I was a little stunned by the question, and I, for whatever reason, didn't feel confident in saying yes. And I decided to shut up and not think about the topic anymore. And so it was for a very long time. And I imagined that I could be a libertarian without seriously engaging this topic. But after last year at FreedomFest, I realized that I had been negligent in my intellectual responsibilities and began to look at it and take the topic seriously. And what I realized was that, of course, the right answer is yes, right? We would be freer. But more importantly than that, I realized that freedom of movement of peoples is inseparable from the idea of liberty itself. You can't cordon that area of life off, that area of politics off, and say we're not going to permit free movement of peoples, we're not going to permit immigration, but in every other way we will be free. That is a kind of an act of mental central planning that maybe makes sense in your own head, but it doesn't make sense in reality. The reality is that immigration restrictions compromise the topic of the idea of liberty itself. It destroys the liberty of American citizens, which people do not typically understand. That if we're going to have the kind of world that the Donald Trumps of this imagine that we're going to have, it will come with surveillance. It will come with massive controls over your life. Your rights will be violated above all else. Your homes will be investigated. Your businesses will be subjected to deep audits. Your freedom will come to an end. It's not possible to maintain freedom with closed borders. So there is that. Now, on the matter of Muslims, I have a little bit of a broader perspective here, because I remember what Jacob referred to in the 1980s with the Cold War going on. Nobody here will believe me, but it's actually true that in those days we were told that there was no greater ally in the struggle against Soviet communism than hardcore Islamic radicalism, because they believed in family values. And They were not secular, you know, and secularism was the enemy at the time. And so American tax dollars funded the rise of the so-called freedom fighters in Afghanistan, which if you fast forward in history, you know what became of that, right? But it was considered a canonical truth of Republican orthodoxy at the time, that you must, if you hate communism, you must love Islam, and not just Islam, but the most extremist elements within it. I was at a meeting at Capitol Hill held by Howard Phillips, who I think has since died, but the Conservative Caucus. And it was a luncheon. We were supposed to meet a freedom fighter that day. And I remember riding up in the elevator with a man who seemed very strange to me, actually. And, well, very strange. And we got up to the luncheon, and I thought, well, this is so strange that he's been invited to this awesome, prestigious Capitol Hill event where we're meeting a freedom fighter. It turned out he was like a captain in the military in Mujahideen, actually, and he was the luncheon speaker. And he got up and called for a holy war, you know, and so on from the microphone. Very loud, very aggressive. And there was a translator there who proceeded to tell us that he believed in free enterprise, traditional values, and limited government. I was a little skeptical. So, okay, look, my friends, the reason I tell that story, don't let yourself be manipulated. They're trying to manipulate us. They're lying to you. The newest, I grew up in a world where we feared the communists more than anything else. We had to let go of our freedoms. You had to get rid of your freedoms. Just didn't matter as much as fighting the communists. And then one day, they all sort of weirdly went away. And about 10 years went by and nobody could figure out who the new enemy would be. We needed one. So, we live in George Orwell's 1984. So suddenly our allies became our enemies. And now there's a tremendous frenzy and fear about Islam alive in the land. It's very difficult for me to personally take it very seriously, I must say, just because I have this deep history. Let me just make one more point about the open immigration issue, which I believe in very strongly. 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, yes. And I too was raised on the border in Texas. Did you know that, Jim? I was raised in El Paso, Texas. And so I lived in a world of demographic upheaval and all the conflicts that come with that, but also all the richness and the beauty of a mixed population, which I've come to love so deeply living in a place like Atlanta. The beautiful thing about having people who are different live together is that you discover through free enterprise and commercial life ways to serve each other, and there is no greater magic in this world than to discover that and to live among it. It's wonderful. The intolerance, the racism, the bigotry that we've seen unleashed in this country in the last year, my friends, it is very, very dangerous. It's dangerous to you, to your liberties, to our future, to our freedoms. We cannot tolerate it. Don't engage in it. Don't participate in it. Freedom and diversity, mixed populations engaged in commerce and building civilization together as human beings, that's the basis on which, that's the basis and the foundation of the good life itself. If somebody tells you otherwise, they don't have your best interests at heart. A century ago, we saw the rise in this country of a very wicked ideology called Eugenics. Its foundation was white supremacy. Everybody, more than white supremacy, it was more like WASP supremacy, right? And that ideology was the basis of the building of the very institutions that oppress us today. The welfare state came out of that ideology. Zoning laws, Jim Crow, marriage licenses, immigration restrictions, labor regulations, they were all rooted in eugenic ideology. All the research is coming out, it's all coming out today, and it all stems from a kind of a wild, insane demographic panic and fear, something that taps into the lowest, most base instincts of the human personality, the fear and loathing of people who are different from you. This is what's going on in this country today. It's terrifying because it threatens your freedom. You are all today in a position to do something about this. Each of you, in your own life and in your own way, can make a contribution to tolerance, to freedom of association. Reject it. Reject the fear. Reject the intolerance. Defend liberty. You can help. I'm more and more convinced that we face some very scary days ahead in this country. The Republican Party has been taken over by what I consider to be fascistic elements, very similar to those that gave rise to Leviathan a century ago with the eugenics movement. You're being encouraged to celebrate a kind of a strong man who promises to save you from foreign dangerous elements. But it's all snake oil. It's all lies. What this movement will do is take away your liberty and take away everything that's beautiful and precious in your life. Let me just conclude by saying something. A mea culpa of sorts. For 25 years, I ignored this issue. I thought it didn't matter. It does matter. Without the free migration of peoples, we don't have freedom itself. That's how important it is. Thank you very much.
We have 13 minutes for discussion.
Could you talk about the problems that the Europeans have with integrating their immigrants, if you would, please? And associated problems that come out of that difficulty?
Sure. The primary problem in the case of the Europeans is that they actually don't, they use a rhetoric, particularly the French, of one French people, all citizens of the Republic, but they don't practice that. Their labor markets lock off and discriminate against the immigrant communities that have come from their former Arab colonies from when they had the empire in North Africa. They set up these public housing arrangements in these satellite communities around the major French cities such as Paris. And they become totally segregated, alienated, jobless. The French have 10% unemployment. The unemployment rate in these satellite, predominantly Arab Muslim areas is anywhere from 20 to 30%, if not more, for youth unemployment there. They give them a welfare system that enables them to just sort of vegetate there. No meaning, no purpose, no hope. And what happens? People despondent, angry, frustrated, then listen to these people. Now, there was this terrible tragedy in Nice, France, yesterday. I'm sure all of you heard about it. This nut drove this giant truck during the Bastille Day ceremony last night. Killed what, 84 people. Children were killed. 50 are in the hospital injured. And one of the profiles of him, he was a petty criminal, like many of them have been. They're locked out of their societies because of the interventionist welfare state. They often turn to crime. They're sent to prison. And 70% of the inmates in French prison are Muslims or descendants of Arab Muslims from their former colonies. And you have these imams there, and they just sort of indoctrinate them. Have a purpose. Don't do these things just randomly. And this is what has created an alien, hostile population, because they don't believe in the individualism and the freedom that we we were founded upon, and to a great extent still believe in and even practice compared to them. The same thing is in Germany. The German welfare state is pervasive. You get free housing, you get free furniture, you get an income, and a very narrowly restricted area of activity that you're allowed as long as you're on their welfare state. And they fester in these communities too. So this is the reason why. They create an environment where they set up communities in which you're going to cultivate these types of mad acts.
Yes, sir.
Actually, let me just add to that. First of all, that's a great answer. It's a brilliant answer. Labor law violates human rights. And I mean, that includes the minimum wages, all kinds of occupational licensure restrictions, working hours regulations, all the things that Europe is famous for, which we also have in this country. And that's right, it locks people out of the job market. And it does foster a sort of radicalism. Again, if you look back a century ago and ask yourself, why do we have these things? They were specifically designed for eugenic purposes. I mean, that's why the minimum wage came along. It was to lock people out of the job market so that they would not thrive and they would not have children, and that we could exterminate them in one generation. That's a quote from I think it was Frank Tausig's book, Principles of Economics at the time. That was the purpose of them. But we can see the damage done with these kind of regulations. But look, the question is, what do we do about this? Do we shut down free migration, or do we free our economies? That's the really critical issue. And we gain nothing by excluding people from immigrating. Where we get the gains from is actually deregulating our economies. That's the answer to Europe, actually. And shutting down more freedoms for people is not going to make any kind of contribution whatsoever.
Yes, sir.
Do you think this anti-immigration movement will require us to show our papers when asked? When my sister and I were driving back from Arizona into Texas, there was a stop, and they asked my sister who was driving, "Are you a citizen, an American citizen?" She said yes. They asked me the same question. I said, "Am I being detained?" He asked me again. I gave the same answer. He asked my sister, "Is he a citizen?" She said yes. So we were waved on. But that's scary, that I have to justify my existence. Do you think this will continue as the anti-immigration movement continues?
It will not only continue, it'll get worse. The American Southwest is now a police state. I've been through the checkpoints you're talking about. If you're Anglo, they'll wave you through. If you're dark-skinned, if you don't have your passport with you, even though you've never entered Mexico, you're in trouble. They will detain you. And if you persist in not answering their questions, they will bash your window in and they will beat you up because they've done that. This is what immigration controllers often forget, that with immigration comes enforcement, just like thunder comes with lightning. And that means a police state, just like they have in Cuba. I've been in Cuba. They have those kind of checkpoints on the highway in Cuba. And it's only going to get worse because none of their controls ever work. Socialism doesn't work. So no matter what they do, no matter who they elect, it's not going to work. But the controls are going to get worse and worse.
If I can just say a historical comparison, maybe some of you have heard of a famous libertarian female author named Rose Wilder Lane. She wrote in the 1940s a famous book called The Rediscovery of Freedom. But she also has this little monograph called Give Me Liberty. And she begins it, I read it a long time ago, but I believe she begins it well explaining that she was on a trip to Europe, somewhere in Central Europe, and the police show up in some cafe or nightclub or something, and they start randomly asking to see people's papers. Where are your papers? Yeah. And she makes the contrast between that and the United States. The United States of her time, of I presume the 1920s and 30s, you didn't have to show papers. You might have to if you stop by the police to show a driver's license, but you know what I mean. You didn't have to show papers. But the point is, once the government introduces the kind of migration and legitimate legal workplace rules that immigration was involved, there is no escaping the requirement to have some variation of a national identity card. Your papers, which you're expected to have on you at all times and to show the authorities unless you want to have severe legal problems. And in that sense, we are going into the statism and the collectivism that someone like Rose Wire Delane was trying to warn us again about back in the 1940s.
Yes, ma'am.
I have one comment and then I have a question for you, sir. Jeffrey, like you, I had to come to this. I just felt that the dangers and the welfare state, as everyone here has stated, the welfare state is a problem for a lot of the unrest that we see both in this country with the ghettos and also over in Europe. But you said something that kind of hits to the heart of why originally I was against refugees, immigration. You said that if you had to pay more taxes, so be it. But I look at this as the whole problem that the government can do whatever they please because they steal our money. And that's the thing we have to really stop, because they wouldn't be able to have their wars, they wouldn't be able to have the border wars, they wouldn't be able to have the welfare state if they weren't able to steal our money. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I love these audiences. I did want to suggest that I'm complacent about taxation. As a libertarian, I oppose all taxation, and especially the income tax or direct taxes. I mean, the IRS is the most tyrannical agency in U.S. history. And so I'm glad you make the point. Absolutely, it's funding the welfare and the warfare state. We wouldn't have all these foreign interventions and foreign wars without this jugular vein along with the Federal Reserve System. So yeah, I'd say abolish it all.
I just briefly, you mentioned Milton Friedman, and as a journalist I used to interview him, and he got very latched on the idea toward the end of his life of auctioning visas, selling them off, and of course if you had enough up for auction, the price could be pretty low and employers would probably want to buy them. Big question is where the money would go. But so he had a big strong view about that. We'll let them in, but let's have an auction of the visas. My question is only having to do with the views, as I think you three gentlemen know, about immigration that's come from the Mises Institute, from writers like Hans Hermann Hoppe. There's at least a point he makes that we can't escape, that if you own private property, you can keep people off your property, and immigrants are trespassing on that property. He elaborated on that in different ways, and I guess I could imagine that if we had an anarcho-capitalist society and everybody was xenophobic, everybody hated, Jews like me and half Jews like Richard, then we Jews would just go nowhere. Because that private property would be owned.
But only half of me will be allowed to.
You got to straddle the border.
Okay, actually, because if your mom is Jewish, Richard, you know that.
I know.
You know.
But don't tell people that. I want at least half of me to come in.
And tell that to the Gestapo when they come around. But anyway, but that aside, of course, that you're probably familiar with, I know Lou Rockwell, I believe, has echoed Hans Hermann Hoppe's views, that clearly you have property rights and these people on your property. I believe, of course, in part, just to insert, in part, I think employers always want immigrant labor, so that's probably where that trumps his point. But could you address that rather ugly views of the Mises
Let me
Institute?
say that I was there when Hans manufactured this ridiculous argument, and he did it as a way of sort of pleasing, the paleo-conservatives that we were hanging out with at the time. And it was a silly argument, really. He has it entirely upside down. I mean, since immigration restrictions are the actual violation of property rights, he acted as if the immigrants were violating property rights. It violates your property rights to prevent you from hiring. And it was a strange argument because it was made entirely in the abstract and had nothing to do with the reality of immigration today. I recently spoke at Google headquarters, and probably, I don't know, my estimate was like a third of the people there are on H-1B visas, Immigration is the whole key to our lives there. And if Hans Hoppe had his way, none of these people would be in the country. They're not violating anybody's rights. They're making free search engines for you, improving your internet experience. I mean, there are benefactors. He acts as if they're invaders. But this argument really, it was strange because it flipped the whole liberal paradigm on its head. And as for the other person you mentioned, don't want to say anything.
Yeah, I might add to that, that every illegal immigrant here is by consent. He's not sleeping out on the public roads and the public parks. He comes in the public highways and bridges and then finds his way into private jobs that are willing to hire him and private homes that are willing to, the owners are willing to lease to him. And that's exactly what would happen in a limited government philosophy or even an anarchist philosophy, which many libertarians are.
You know, it's
I'm
sorry.
I am very sorry, but a contract's a contract, and we agreed with Skousen that we would exit this room at 10 till. I apologize for you, those of you that are still in line. We've got another panel, though, at 10:30 on separating money in the state, the denationalization of money. I hope you'll come. It's in Celebrity 5. Thank you very much for attending. We're very grateful.